Welcome to Savage Minds. I'm your host, Julian Vigo. Today's guest is Fiona M. Girkin, a specialist in dark traits of females and a researcher in female psychopathic behaviour. Fiona works with people who have been tangled in a web of bad behaviour by the women in their lives and provides resources, training, and problem-solving strategies to help them escape and manage toxic women. I welcome Fiona M. Girkin to Savage Minds. As I wrote you via email, we've been covering some of the monolithic narratives coming out of feminist camps that don't hold water. And your research addresses this. Not only your research, there's a lot of research in the field of female psychopathy, of controlling behavior within relationships exerted by women. I'd like to maybe kick off with, how does primary psychopathy in women differ from the same traits typically seen in men?
Yeah, I think one of the key things about female psychopathy over male psychopathy is that women are very covert. So, whereas a man might outrightly yell at you or hurt you physically, a woman will do it relationally. So, she'll do it through relational aggression and gaslighting. So, rumors, those kind of things. So, reducing your social standing and doing it in such a way that it's very hard to prove. So, that's one of the key differences between men and women when it comes to psychopathy. Women use more social relational manipulation that is harder to prove than physical outright aggression.
You've used the term sleeper cell psychopaths.
Mm.
What does that mean in the workplace or domestic context?
Yeah, I think most of my research has been in the workplace, but I've also done quite a bit in looked into the psychopathic traits in the home and domestic violence. And what I mean by the sleeper cell is often these people can be so nice and so lovely and so likable. They start at a workplace and you want to be their best friend. Because they're so engaging and charming, and you want to get along with them because there's someone that you want to be around. Same thing in a relationship. They're the kind of people that you meet that seem to tick all your boxes that you're looking for in a relationship. But this can go on for, and what I mean by a sleeper cell is that this can go on for some time until something changes, whether that's in the workplace or whether that's in the relationship. Something changes that triggers them. And that was one of the things I found in my PhD research. It was almost like it didn't matter how long this person had been in the workplace. If they were getting what they wanted, if they had the power and control that they needed and wanted to satisfy their psychopathic urges, nothing would change, and they'd be probably minor bullying. But if someone tried to actually challenge that power, that would often be the triggering event that would change their behavior overnight, and they'd become quite ruthless in the workplace. And the same thing can happen in relationships.
You discuss relational aggression tactics that female psychopaths use to gain power. How does this differ from any kind of tactics that men might use? And are women more prone to relational aggression tactics?
Yeah, so relational aggression has been called by some researchers as a female behaviour. That said, men do use relational aggression. One of the things I found in my research, and I mainly looked at what's called the community services sector. So it's a female caring sector, therapists, social workers, psychologists, the caring mental health kind of sector. So one of the things was that I found that the male psychopaths that I found in that sector also used relational aggression to a higher degree than I expected. The women always used it more, but the men also used it. And my theory was that the men used the relational aggression side of things because because they were targeting women, they knew that when they targeted a woman in that way, that was going to be the most harmful way to target a woman. So men and women do use it, but women are way more likely to use it because women are way more hurt when they're rejected by other women than they are when they're rejected by men in the workplace in like a social setting.
And what are the specific tactics that they might use to gain power then? You mentioned already the kind of manipulations in terms of, I guess, what we might call defamation.
Yeah, so one of the things they'll do is so in terms of that relational work they do to gain power, is they'll make sure that they're friends with the right people in the workplace. They make sure they're friends with the higher ups, the management, people that are going to support them and people that can protect them. So it's like they create this protective layer by associating with the right people.
Mhm.
And because these people go, hang on a minute, how could this person be doing this? This person's lovely. They're doing this, this, and this. So no one's going to. So when someone that's of a lower level in the workplace says, hang on a minute, this woman was bullying me. She was really quite horrible to me. No one's going to believe that person. So they make sure that they have what I call a posse of other people around them, men and women, that will protect them if someone does try and say, hang on a minute, that behavior is not okay.
Yeah, Dr. Ramani, who has been instrumental for me in dealing with my psychopath, calls these flying monkeys, the kind of people that
Mm.
are always there to, like in The Wizard of Oz, when the witch says, "Go get Dorothy," and they just do what she says because there's this kind of faith in this person, often because of what you pointed out at the beginning, that they can be quite affable and people will be believing them and saying, "Oh, but they're loved. They could have done that."
Yeah, and I've done worked with people where they've been the only one in the workplace that has been the target for whatever reason. Well, there was one woman in particular that I interviewed as part of my research who was more qualified than anyone else in the workplace. She actually had a PhD, whereas no one else did. So the boss saw her as a threat. So, in order to protect her own patch and as manager, she just went after this person and denied them leave, denied them attending family events. No, you can't have that leave to go to some important event in another state, that kind of thing. So, using their power to control the person, what the person is able to do. I see a lot of that with training as well. I find a lot of psychopaths will target training opportunities, so they won't allow the person to attend training opportunities that they might like to attend, and that's quite common.
Something related is your PhD focused on the community sector service. Why is that industry particularly vulnerable to these personality types? It sort of falls into my belief that, no offense to you, of course, but there's a focus within people who study psychology of
Mhm.
not being well themselves.
Yeah, actually, I'm not offended by that because that is the case. The majority of people who work in the sector, and the reason I did it in that sector is I'd worked myself in that sector for 20 years in a range of roles, mostly with services that were either 80% women or 100% women. And what you find is there are a large portion of people in that sector that go into that industry because they're carrying some kind of trauma and they want to help others. That was certainly why I got into it.
Mhm.
I'd had some mental health issues as a teenager, but also I'd escaped domestic violence at a very young age. So yeah, I went into it, and you find that there's not too many studies around how many people have mental health issues, but certainly my own experiences of interviewing people and getting to know people in that sector, many people were carrying some serious trauma. But that was also compounded by the high feminization of that sector, which was causing a lot of issues in terms of workplace bullying.
How do female psychopaths weaponize societal expectations of nurturing or victimhood?
Yeah, look, that was a question I asked myself because I was like, how has this sector? Because when I initially did my research, I'd had a bad experience, which led me to it, and I thought, well, I'm not going to find too many psychopaths. Maybe I'll find one person that'll meet the criteria. But I found way more than I ever expected. And what I found was that when I looked into it further, I found some minor research, more recent research around heroism. So you think about the firefighter who starts a blaze so that they can rescue people and be the hero. It's the same thing. These people go in. So from whereas men might go into like a corporate field where they can manipulate and get financial gain, it's easier for a female psychopath to hide in a caring industry where they have control over personal resources. So you think about a sector where they control access to housing, access to food, access to funds to help someone who might be poor pay their electricity bill. You think about a sector like nursing. You know, a nurse can choose to help somebody or withhold treatment or overtreat someone, causing their serious harm. And that's a huge amount of control over someone's personal well-being. So I think that's a massive issue, and I'm now understanding that a lot better than I did when I started my research 6 7 years ago now, because I was the same. I was like, why would these people even go into a caring profession? But they have a lot more power than when you actually start to think about the power over people and people's emotions, way more than we realize because we look at it from a caring and nurturing perspective.
And is there this kind of messiah complex, perhaps, that works to defer or even elide completely their own issues so that maybe they are displacing their own issues by focusing on everything but themselves?
Yeah, I'd actually, yeah, I'd have to agree with that. There are a lot of people in the sector who get a real kick out of the gratitude and helping others. I mean, some do it altruistically and they just like helping people, but others do it to, be, oh, look at me, look what I've done. So that real narcissistic kind of attitude, where they come across as not actually doing it. It's not something they do behind closed doors without anybody knowing. They need everyone to know how wonderful they are and how caring they are. And I think there's a real sense of misplaced maternal instinct. Although many people in the sector do have children, I think that there's a sense of, because a lot of women are not able to be those full-time carers for their children anymore, they go into these workplaces and create an environment where their staff are their children and they mother them to the point of controlling them, as though they are children.
Yes. One thing I found out with my psychopath is that people around her treated her as a child, still do, I imagine. And it becomes this kind of Moebius strip of what I guess in pop psychology would be called codependency. They seem to attract people who want to protect them. So the flying monkeys are not just victims, they're volitional flying monkeys.
Yeah.
And this will to believe in the goodness of the person who's affected quite a bit of damage. It's quite fascinating to me sociologically.
Yeah, and a lot of female psychopaths will play the victim. I mean, male psychopaths do it too, but women are way more likely to play the victim card, especially once they're found out or someone tries to performance manage them in a workplace. They will play the victim, and by having that victim status, it's really hard to criticize someone. It's really hard to say, actually, no, you're not doing a good job if they're sitting there crying and going, oh, but my husband left me, or my kids are having issues at school. So I think they'll often use those emotions as a manipulation tactic. And when you think about the sector, we were just saying how there are a lot of people that are quite mentally unwell in the sector. So many of them are actual victims. So it's easy to then use that to manipulate people. Not everyone, but there are certainly those that do use that status as a way of getting away with bad behavior.
And can you explain the difference between a narcissist and a primary psychopath in your framework?
Yeah, and I mean this is there's a lot of different opinions on what that looks like.
Mhm.
My thinking is a psychopath is someone who it's they're a win at all cost mentality. They don't actually truly care about other people. It's all about them winning and getting what they want, whether that's career advancement, whether that's gratitude, whether that's stealing something from somebody else, such as money or even the boyfriend or husband. So they're a lot more ruthless. When you look at the dark tetrad, which is psychopathy, narcissism, Machiavellianism, and now sadism has been added to that. Psychopathy incorporates all of them, and it is the most dangerous of all of them. When I think about narcissism, it's all about me. I need all the attention and I need all the focus on me. And when it's not on me, I'm going to throw a bit of a tantrum. So I call it the all about me scenario.
Mhm.
I did. I mean, I know there's different schools of thought around ability for people to change. Now the research around psychopathies, they don't have the ability to change. I've seen quite a bit of research around narcissism that says they do have the capacity to change if they want to, but not everyone agrees with me on that. A lot of people say that narcissists don't change, but that's certainly not the research that I've seen. So
And there's also, I think, at the heart of all this, I like to use the American comedian Sarah Silverman, who says, stinky people don't know they stink, as a metaphor for what's going on here. In order to want to change, you have to acknowledge that there's something to change. And I
mm.
think that must again, this falls out of 1980s pop psychology, which has been disproven. The idea that half the work is acknowledging you have a problem, which is completely rubbish. If that were true, you wouldn't have a job. I think that no, but truly, it's a ridiculous
Mm.
proposition. The biggest hurdle is to acknowledge you have a problem. It falls out of AA too, a bit of this, but I think that there's a lot of truth on both sides of this in the sense of the people who say narcissists can't change, and Dr. Ramani's one of them, is because
Yes.
her belief is that they can't even acknowledge that they have any problems, which,
Mm.
given my experience with someone who initially I thought was borderline, then I was told by people describing the behavior and the torments we were undergoing, no, this is a narcissist. And then the more time that elapsed and the more things I saw, I'm like, I think this person's a full-on psychopath. And the problem is that, at the risk of doing some kind of armchair psychology, the fact is that I'm seeing these kinds of traits growing with online culture,
Mm.
and the kind of misbehavior that is allowed to persist on online culture isn't any more limited to online culture. Have you noticed that in your practice?
I certainly have in I mean, like I said, I've been looking at this topic for over 7 years now, but I mean, I've worked in the sector for over 20 years. And I certainly had seen that. I've seen that increase. You see it in society in general, just even watching social media. People have become very insular and very selfish. I did notice a real change during COVID. And I think the fact that we went through a period of being quite isolated, people became very much focused in online interactions. And I think that changed things. And I think it's actually exacerbated from that point. Dr. Jordan Peterson often talks about the fact that female traits and female dark traits like psychopathy and narcissism translate very well online. You often see a lot of women targeting people online more so than men. But yeah, women, and it feeds into that narrative of people that are using their victim status or wanting attention. It feeds into that because the social media pushes you in a direction that um, reinforces your narrative. So um, it doesn't matter what you're feeling. It's never going to push you in a direction that says actually what you're thinking is wrong and maybe you need to have another look at what's going on for you. I mean, I think even a lot of therapy these days, people don't. It's all about affirming people and people's opinions and beliefs instead of challenging people's beliefs and challenging what we think about the world in general.
Yes, I've thought a lot about social media's rise of these kinds of abuses during COVID and lockdowns, because it does this thing where it also propagates more flying monkeys, and a load of them. And I noticed
Yes.
this from the way that people have been drawn to op ed. So, Savage Minds, I took early on a mandate to try and do hard news. How can you have an opinion if you don't have facts? We can all like read op eds our whole life, but if we're basing our like or dislike of op eds on other op eds, then we're really just reacting emotionally to everything. So when I noticed that readers across the internet are sharing stories, that when you start talking to them, you realize they haven't read the story. And I think this happens with the flying monkey phenomenon as well. People will like whatever someone says or posts without reading the primary source. And that's a rich terrain for the flying monkeys to believe whoever is online saying, he aggressed me with his stare. I saw this a lot during the Me Too movement. Everyone was apt to just accuse a man of being a rapist because someone would say something that often didn't even exist. And I found this really troubling because I thought, what about due process? What about reality? But that didn't figure into their framework at all. So I wonder to what degree social media is just upping the ante on this kind of misbehavior where people themselves who fall into the psychopathic framework are being propagated, moved forward, because I think flying monkeys help them. They give them the petrol to keep going, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, well, I mean, you think about it in the sense of someone who is an influencer or has a YouTube channel or Instagram or TikTok. It's the amount of people that are subscribing and following them, and so they're actually physically seeing the flying monkeys, if you want to put it that way, following and getting that attention. So they'll put a post on complaining about something and they'll get extra attention. And I can think of a number of people online that do that. And you think, why are people watching this content? And I don't know whether people watch it because it's, they're laughing at the person being irate, or they simply like what they're hearing. But yeah, you're generally seeing these people constantly get encouraged by comments and extra and people liking and following them.
Are female psychopaths more prone to have leadership positions in offices than males?
I think so, yes. I think a male psychopath is more likely to, aim a lot higher, like aim at the high corporate level. Whereas the female psychopath, I think, is quite satisfied being the CEO of a small organization because they still have that power, but they also have the flexibility to hide because they're not in a big organization. I think that they are, yeah, way more likely to be in those smaller office spaces because they can manipulate what's going on around them. And like I was talking about earlier about the relational aggression, one of the things that I found in my research was in terms of male psychopaths and a lot of the study around corporate psychopaths, you see a lot of men being looked at in that space. Whereas with the female psychopath, she might be more happy to hide in an office and target either the manager above her, the subordinates below her, or someone who sits in the desk next to her. So in my research, actually, it was a third for each group. So I asked people whether it was their manager, whether it was a peer, or whether it was a subordinate, and it was 30% in each. So it was equally divided into three. Whereas males will often target down. Women don't care what direction because it's not really about who holds the power in terms of the role in the workplace. It's more about who don't they like. So it's more that relational. Who don't they like? Who don't they want around them? Who's not supporting them? Whereas a man is more likely to target down.
And what are the financial and psychological costs to an organization when a female psychopath is in the leadership role?
Yeah, so massive, because what happens is you'll see a real reducing of that job satisfaction. So people really struggling at work, people taking lots of leave, long lunches because they just don't want to be in the workplace. The amount of people in my research that said they would sit in their cars and cry before they went into work and when they came out of work. For some reason, that seemed to be a thing that a lot of women spoke about, that they would just be so overwhelmed that it was really hard to even walk through the doors. So what you're seeing is a lack of motivation, a lack of productivity. So you're seeing that reducing first. You also see a mass exodus, so people resigning and leaving, and then you've got the cost of. So you've not only got the cost of things like workers' compensation in Australia, where people might go on leave and want to be compensated for the trauma and the bullying. You've got extra sick leave. You've got legal fees if someone does try and take the organisation to court for what's happened to them. You've got recruitment fees. I mean, recruiting people is really expensive. Most industries, it costs quite a few $1,000s to recruit someone because you've got to, take time away to organise the recruitment process, the interviews. It is costs to advertise. So I don't have a figure off the top of my head, but I know that there is some research around the cost is quite substantial depending on the organisation. But it's mainly that lack of productivity, the reduce of and the reduction of ability for the workplace to function. It really just derails the whole workplace.
Were you able to compare your research to what happens in the workplace when men are at the helm?
I didn't actually do that work, but I'd like to. My one of my supervisors was actually Dr. Clive Boddy, who was one of the leading researchers in corporate psychopathy. So I felt very privileged to have him on my team. Um, but I didn't actually do that comparison. I did more of an overarching comparison of the different behaviours.
Mhm.
I have thought about going back and actually looking at research and doing that comparison or doing a larger research project. But yeah, I haven't actually done that work yet, no.
Is there a biological component to these traits in women, or is it purely social conditioning, do you think? Although I will say that Dr. Ramani says this constantly, that narcissists and psychopaths are driven towards high positions of power, generally speaking.
And she's right. Generally speaking, they'll look for positions of power. But like I said earlier, caring professions hold a lot of power. Even a self-employed psychologist who has people come in and share their deepest, darkest secrets. I mean, that therapist has a lot of control over how that person recovers and how they can manipulate their thinking. So I think, yeah, so it's that level of it. So power and control can look different for everybody. And I think, like I said, I think women seek out power over others more so than um, power over money and people and organizations, but they do seek power and they find it in other ways.
What are some of the early red flags that someone should look out for when meeting a potential female psychopath?
I think some of the key things are they need to be someone that is able to self reflect on their own behavior. Psychopaths will often deflect if something goes wrong. They'll always blame someone else. They'll always have a scapegoat ready and they'll always blame other people. They have no ability to reflect on what they've done and take accountability. And if they do, it's a manipulation tactic. So they might do it just to look good. And they can do that. They often lack empathy. So they might fake emotions, but they don't really have care for others. If they appear to care for someone, it's because it looks good for them and they can get something out of it. So there's some of the key things. It's that really ability to self-reflect. Um, Listen to how they talk about others. I often are curious about that conversation. What people say about other people, they're probably saying but about you behind your back. I've heard that saying before. But yeah, just
Mhm.
listening to how they talk. Do they big note themselves? Do they name drop? Name dropping's a big one for psychopaths. They might be in your job interview and saying, I know so and so in the sector, and I know this person, and I know that person. So they name drop a lot, and they really do promote themselves in the way that they talk. So, yeah, there's some of the key things to look for.
You have all the ingredients of social media right there, right?
Yes.
No, it's fascinating. Okay, now we get to get into the weeds because, as I mentioned before we started recording, while I was preparing to speak with you, I had no idea the controversy surrounding you, which I love. You made several comments in May of last year regarding the comparable rates of domestic violence between men and women
Mhm,
during an interview with men's rights commentator Bettina Arndt.
mhm,
Now, I find this shocking because anyone who has looked at the studies of domestic violence in same sex couples, and I mean lesbian couples, will know that the rates of domestic violence are actually slightly higher. Now, I know the feminists listening might not like that, and facts are facts. The thing is that we see that there is, in fact, a phenomenon of domestic violence that is not simply limited to men affecting violence. Feminist organizations, however, as I've found here where I live in Europe, in Italy, they have so programmed the political environment, including police, social work, government, to only listen to male violence, male violence, male violence, that when you are the victim of female violence, there is very little to be done.
mm,
You have to scream to have your rights or even the crimes themselves recognized in law. And I think that what I've witnessed in my own experience in having to come to terms with what my children and I have been through is that as much as feminist organizations have worked for many years on issues regarding fair pay, women's ability to sign a rental contract or take out a credit card without the father or husband signing, all good stuff, right? We'd all agree on any side of the political aisle. Great work. But this tagline of male violence has bored me to tears. I'm a bit over the patriarchy talk as well. I'm an anthropologist. This is a perversion of what anthropology had, in fact, argued in terms of societal and familial structures of power. This wasn't a literal men have all power and women are victims, bang, bang, bang on your head with a big club. No. I find these kinds of ideas also moronically simplified, and they infantilize women as subjects in their own right. So I wanted to maybe talk about first what happened to you after this interview in May of last year, because you suffered severe repercussions from, often lodged by the very women who've been, as I mentioned to you before we started taping, the same women who were fighting being no platformed by men's rights advocates in dresses who said, you should be fired because you're not calling me a woman, because you're not using my pronouns, because you won't let me into your lesbian space online, as many women have been fighting for the past 15 years, more even.
Mm.
Could you discuss a bit of what's happened to you?
Yeah, so I was at the time I was working for the local university and teaching the local police all about domestic violence. When I came on board on the role, I was stoked. I loved teaching the police. It was really quite a cool role. I thought, oh, just about to finish my PhD, and I've managed to walk into this awesome academic position. And I spent a lot of time talking with the police that I taught. So I taught recruits mainly, but I also taught promotional police. And I spent a lot of time speaking with police at all levels about the domestic violence space, given that's what I was teaching, because I really wanted to give, especially the new recruits, I wanted to give them a clear picture of what they were going to see once they went out in the field. And one of the things I was hearing was that the police were seeing as many women as men committing domestic violence. And I was actually quite shocked by this, to be honest. I was actually a little bit shocked. And um, because I thought, oh, that's interesting that that's what they're saying. So they're not swayed by the agenda. And I was stoked by that. So I really started to, in my teaching, and I've always said I'm not a feminist. I used to be years ago. And after being attacked by many feminists, even before what happened to me last year, I'd made the decision that I just, I felt like feminism had lost its way in terms of criticizing men. So anyway, so when I was teaching the police, I really started to make sure that I used non-gendered language, because I didn't think that the gender mattered that much, simply because if the behavior is the same, why are we treating it differently depending on whether it's a woman or a man? Especially because when women committed violence, it was like, okay, what happened? Was she retaliating? Was it his fault? Whereas the man does it and he's just a horrible person. So there was this real narrative. And I was so stoked that the police were seeing that, because I could use what I knew about female psychopaths, but also dark personalities within my teachings. And Bettina contacted me to do an interview. I'd reached out to her because she was someone that was willing to talk about the other side, because I like to get all sides of the argument. I like to know both sides. I didn't reach out to her because I was a men's rights advocate. It was simply to better understand. And she wanted to do an interview with me. Initially, I said no, and then I contacted her again 12 months later just to touch base, and I decided to go ahead and do the interview because I was really excited about what the Tasmanian police were doing. They were doing an amazing job. And look, hilariously, this week there's an article that's come out that said Tasmanian police are arresting 1 in 4 arrests are of women perpetrators. How can this happen? So what happened to me was when I spoke to Bettina about what the police were seeing, I was in a lot of trouble from both the police and the university and the feminists in Tasmania, who said, oh, how dare you? That's not right. That's not what the stats show. My argument is the stats don't show that, because what's happening is as they go through the system, the female perpetrators, excuses are made for them and the charges are dropped. So what's happening is more men are being charged. Which I didn't talk about that at the time. But anyway, so the feminists lost their mind. They complained to the police. They complained to the university, and I was stood down from my role. I was not disciplined as much as the news looks like that. And the university and I had to come to an agreement because the police no longer wanted me teaching. They had a say in who taught, and the feminists had kicked up such a stink to the police that they just went, look, they needed to distance themselves from me, clearly. What I found hilarious is if you read the articles about it, it says, what Dr. Girkin said does not align with the principles of the Tasmanian police. They didn't say I was wrong. They didn't say I was wrong. They said it didn't align with the principles. So it was interesting this week, like I said, nearly 12 months on, this article's come out about, oh my God, they're arresting all these women. Well, I'm not surprised. In fact, I'm surprised they're not arresting more. But since that time, I've sort of gone out on my own, and people sort of know who I am now in terms of that space. And I get a lot of emails from men and women who have experienced the domestic violence system. A lot of mothers whose sons have been arrested, a lot of men who have been beaten black and blue by their partners and then go to the police and then they get arrested. They're the ones that accused of being the perpetrator. So I'm not surprised men don't speak up. And I've had a lot of contact with men's groups over the last 12 months who have said, thank you for what you're doing, because I know that it's not easy. And I made the decision after leaving the university that initially I looked for another job, and then I went, no, do you know what? I don't need to be told what to say anymore. And so doing things like talking on your podcast, doing my own podcast and YouTube stuff, and working with people specifically around female bad behavior. So I work directly with clients who are dealing with specifically bad behavior in women. It's not something other people are doing because they're not willing to do it. You know yourself that, the threats that come with that. And I've been pretty lucky. I've been pretty protected from it. No one's really come after me directly. It's all happened relationally. Funny that. I've seen the screenshots of the private chat groups that talked about getting me fired and that I needed to go, and that because there are certain people in those groups that have shared that with me. But I'm quite happy doing what I'm doing now because it's all been worth it, because I see the importance of the things that I said more so now than ever. So what I did after I left was I ended up doing some real in-depth research and learning a lot more about the issue, and finding that I was way more right than I thought I was. I was only talking anecdotally in the interview, but now I know that I was actually right and should have been teaching even more about that bilateral violence. But yeah, so that's what happened to me.
Well, what data or observations professionally have led you to the conclusion, beyond the fact that studies do show that as many as half of men simply do not report DV? What can you talk about in terms of the massive underreporting on the one hand, but also the facts that show that men are victims of domestic violence also, or women in same sex couples, by the way?
Yes, yeah, definitely. So I did I really just looked at the research. I went into the journal articles and the research, the big research projects that looked at this stuff. Researchers like Murray Strauss. There's a gentleman by the name of George who runs a site called the Tin Men, and he has a YouTube channel that, and his ability to understand all the stats is amazing. So really just getting to know some of those key people in the field that understand those stats and understand the data, but also myself doing the work, looking at the journal articles, looking at the not just what's being said, but what's in that research. And people send me stuff all the time. Look at this is happening. But finding that it's just been hidden. And if you talk about it, you are in huge amounts of trouble. I mean, the woman that started the first women's shelter in the UK, Erin Peasy, she's done interviews where she talked about the fact that when she started the first women's shelter, that the women coming in, 50% of them were as violent as the men that they had left. And she had death threats. She had to leave the country, as far as I'm aware, or she at least had to move because they basically told her, we don't want anything to do with you. You can't be saying that, even if it's true. And that's the worst thing. It's you get shut down. You're not being dishonest. You're being honest, but people don't want you to know about it. It's like it's this hidden truth that nobody's allowed to talk about. And the amount of men that hide their identities, that share information with me, is not surprising, because a lot of them are actually quite scared, and I don't blame them, because these feminists can be very vicious, because it is usually the feminists.
Yeah, well, the threat of reporting one to the police when you know a priori that she will be believed because she's a woman, that's frightening.
That is massively frightening. Can you, I mean, the believe all women thing is just ridiculous. Why would you think that everyone who says something is honest? I mean, women lie all the time. I'm a woman, I know. Not that I would accuse someone of something, but I follow a lot of cases, a little bit in Australia, but we're very secretive about what we share. A lot of American cases, in particular, of women who make false allegations, that you get to see all the bits and pieces in the court cases and things like that. But it's such a problem. It's a way bigger problem than anyone's willing to admit, because it's so easy to do. All you have to do is say it, and that's it. You don't need any evidence whatsoever. And that's appalling. But we don't offer men that same opportunity. Like, we don't believe all men. It makes no sense to believe everyone. There's always going to be someone that's dishonest. There's always going to be someone that abuses the system. And to think that all women are righteous is a ridiculous thing to think. Now I'm on my soapbox.
You're listening to Savage Minds, and we hope you're enjoying the show. Please consider subscribing. We don't accept any money from corporate or commercial sponsors, and we depend upon listeners and readers just like you. Now, back to our show. But the feminists will say, oh, this is misogyny. Actually, I would argue their view is misogynistic. I think infantilizing women and making them into perpetual victims by virtue of a vagina is infantilizing and is itself ipso facto misogynist. But be that as it may, I mean, I roll now. I just can't take the patriarchy as this reference point. I ask people, what does it mean? And it's this kind of, again, a new Moebius strip of incoherency. But why then do women beat each other up in relationships? Oh, but because the patriarchy also blah, blah, blah. And it never makes
No.
sense. And I'm over trying to make sense of it because I call it the cat ate my homework. That's what it is. Or that's it. The cat ate
Yeah.
my homework. It right there. Why do you believe the gendered lens of domestic violence is an incomplete or incorrect framework?
Because I think when it started, they realized that it was a very profitable industry. And I think now it's all about the grift. And I have no qualms in saying that. I used to work for the state government in Tasmania. I used to be part of the funding, the people that delivered the funding and managed those funding agreements with services. And I know since that time, they've continued to get a hell of a lot more money. So it's a very profitable industry. You know, there's CEOs getting paid huge amounts of money to run these feminist organizations. I think they worry that if it suddenly realised that women are just as violent, what would happen is they would lose some of that funding to support male victims. So it's almost like it's that they think it's mutually exclusive. Oh well, we can't have people recognising male victims because then we'll get less. Or suddenly these female victims that, oh hang on, they must be perpetrators as well. Well, they might be. That's the crazy thing. They actually might be. So I think it's all about the money now. I think it's all about that victim status in terms of, oh, we need to protect all women. And I'm being narky now. That's really bad. Sorry. But I'm so sick of it. I'm actually just so sick of it because, you know, if you could see some of the heartfelt emails I get from men every day, usually de-identified, they don't tell me who they are and they just say thank you. You know, this is what I went through. I just wanted to tell you and thank you because I feel like I've been heard and you understand. And that's just like some of them have resorted me to tears. It's heartbreaking that there's men out there that have nobody, that nobody believes them, and they've reached out to some unknown um, YouTuber or ex-academic just to say thank you. Like it breaks my heart because, you know, I have a lot of great men in my life, and it breaks my heart that that's the kind of way we treat men now and have been for some time.
I think it's also a problem of funding. We see this within what I spoke with you about before we went on the gender wars. They have copied and pasted the feminist model. The feminists are upset that there are men running around saying, you have to call me she, I'm a woman. But at the same time, that ethos came from feminist organizing.
Yes.
And I've had a lot of guests on the show who've pointed this out, and they're not wrong. The problem is, if we're going to make an industry from oppression Olympics, we have to begin to question the ethics of that. We also have to question the ethics of saying things that are just so ridiculous, such as male violence. I'm in the midst of writing a piece on female violence because of what my children and I have gone through and the research and talking to people like you. I've talked to criminologists on the show as well who've worked on this issue. I was newly immigrated into Italy only to find out that I was in lockdown with someone who was, at first I thought dysregulated. Now I believe has serious issues of psychopathy, who is excellent at living a double life, presenting one face here, another face there. And it really threw me over the entire situation because I had no idea until later on. And when I had to actually address the police in this, and I have.
Mm.
And I'm becoming my own advocate because I thought, wait, I've spent my entire life advocating for human rights of people in war torn countries, in situations of physical and economic oppression. And I'm having to do that for myself here because the police told me this full on. We've been so trained by feminist organizations that there's no wiggle room to understand even when men come in with stories like
Mm,
yours. And it really upset me because I thought, well, this is a no-brainer.
mm,
You don't need to go into any kind of classroom to understand that all humans could have a propensity for violence and that these acts of violence aren't limited to someone because they do or do not have a penis. I mean, how ridiculous. So I've been pushing on, but the reality is that I had to finally leave the basic assistance I was getting from an anti-violence hotline during lockdown. I called early on when this happened because the violence started verbally, and my then partner got upset that I actually made calls to people to try and get help because I thought she was having some kind of lockdown breakdown.
mm.
And these organizations, of course, would point to the mural behind them when I met them in person and say, well, at least you're not dead like these women on our Dead Women mural. And none of that
Oh my
helped me.
gosh.
So I finally got help. In Italy, there are 3 domestic violence charities for lesbians, 3. Okay. And when I started telling them about the Darvo I had been through,
Mm.
they were like, "Oh yeah, we've heard this before." Oh my gosh, the things I've been through. I'm actually writing a screenplay about this because it would be perfect. It's sort of like All About Eve plus Single White Female plus a few other movies, Sleeping with the Enemy. And what I came out of this with, it took me a long time to accept that I was married to someone who was completely dishonest. I mean, even that, like, who
Mm,
does this? I kept saying to myself, who does that?
mm,
Who marries someone to rob them? Who does that? Like, it's not in my vocabulary bank. The fact is that institutions have been so blindsided by the training they get in terms of women's rights that they don't even conceive of men's rights. And so you are called, I imagine, a misogynist, an
mm.
anti-feminist, men's rights advocate. What are your thoughts about that?
Um, Look, I don't mind being called a men's rights advocate. I try not to be called that because I really just want to focus on toxic behavior in women. It's not about, because I didn't start my research to protect men, it was to protect women. It was these organizations that were all women that were the problem. Um, I misogynist, yeah, I've had that before. I usually just put out a video on it and justify myself because I can't help it. The one I learnt recently when I started my YouTube channel was the pick me. And I'm like, what is a pick me? And I found out what it was. It was like that women that stick up for men, that just want men to like them. And I told my husband, and he cracked up laughing. He said, "Look, I don't want to offend you, but," he said, "you are the last person I would call a pick me." Because I just, I just care about, um, human rights like yourself. I care about human rights. And I'm a very devoted wife. So I'm not doing this for male attention. And in fact, I try and keep my audience at arm's length for that reason. And, but yeah, some of those, look, I laugh it off now because I just do my research, and I know that what I talk about is based in research, not just feelings. It's about the facts. Um, and I try and make sure that everything I do and everything I talk about is based in facts. And if it's just my opinion, then I try and make sure I state that as well. But yeah, look, I've seen enough angry feminists in my time to know that they scream louder because they don't like the truth. It's not that you know, and they come after you. And I think, well, this is why I did the research I did. It was because women were attacking other women. And so they're just proving my point. Like, it's just, that's the hilarious thing. They're proving my point about why I've done the work I have and why I studied female psychopaths, because of how they treat other women. So yeah, it's an interesting space to be in.
Well, some of them might accuse you of undermining the safety of female victims of male violence through your research, which I find absurd. But how do you react to that accusation?
Yes, I have heard that accusation that I've undermined, that I've set them back in terms of women not coming forward because they're worried they won't be believed now. Well, I say to that is, who do you think I am? Like, people say I don't have that kind of power. I'm not, if that's the case, then I'm sorry that that's happened. But I think that there's a lot of help out there for women, and it's constantly publicized about support for women um, when a man has been violent towards them. So I'm sorry that they feel that way, but I don't believe I've undermined anyone. If anything, I'm trying to help look at the broader picture that it's about behavior, it's not about gender. And you can't slap your husband or your partner as a woman and expect to not have the same consequences if it was the other way around. I mean, it's crazy. Why are we treating it differently? If it's the same behavior, why are we making excuses for women's behavior but not for men's behavior? You can't do both. Like it makes no sense. It's not fair. At the end of the day, it's not fair.
It's the patriarchy. The patriarchy made them do it.
Mm.
I'm sorry. I can't help but be snarky myself. Um, you've described modern feminism as a man-hating ideology that has taken over the domestic violence narrative.
Mhm.
How deeply has this ideology penetrated policing and welfare institutions, and what are the specific consequences for frontline decision making?
Well, I wouldn't have been too worried about it if you'd asked me that 12 months ago. But since doing that interview with Bettina, where everything got derailed, I realised that the police were happy to talk in private with me about what they were actually seeing and what was really going on in the domestic violence space. But to actually have that said publicly was not something they wanted because they want the feminists to believe that that's what they're doing, that they're arresting men and that they're protecting women, and that violent women are just protecting themselves from violent men. They don't really look at that bilateral violence. But if you ask the cops on the ground, they will tell you they know about that. They know that the woman is involved. Like they know cases where that has happened, but they do not want the feminists to know about it because, well, look what happened in terms of me is that it caused huge problems. You've probably seen some of the media reports where these domestic violence services were saying this woman should not be teaching police. Um, and that's the problem. They actually don't want people to know. And it has infiltrated police and it has infiltrated frontline services that are trying to do the right thing. And I've spoken to some retired police, and I know people that have left the police force as a result because they're like, well, I'm not going to just arrest a man because his wife beat him up. Like that just makes no sense. So I think there are people out there that have shied away from staying in the police force for that reason. But yeah, it's definitely infiltrated frontline police, but because and like I said, I saw that firsthand. The fact that what I was hearing behind closed doors at the police academy was very different to what they were willing to say in the paper, um, and what they're willing to say in the media, which was really made me feel very sad because they did like what I was doing, and they had a lot of praise for the work I was doing, but publicly they didn't want people to know what was happening, and I didn't realize how serious of a problem that was.
And how does this framework of the gendered lens influence the way government funding is allocated to social services?
It's a massive influence on it because the feminists scream a lot louder than the men's rights groups. And if the men's rights groups scream about it, it's just, oh, but that's just patriarchy and, respect all women and let's make our children stand up in front of women and apologize for something they have never done. Um, so it's massively influenced the funding. They have a lot of power because they're willing to scream the loudest. It's not that it's the bigger problem. It's that they're the ones willing to scream the loudest. They're the ones that are willing to make physical threats to people if they don't do anything. And like you were saying, these services, these domestic violence services point to the fact, oh, all these women have died. Well, plenty of men have died as well. And often it may not be at the hands of the woman, but often a lot of men commit suicide because the woman has taken everything from them. They no longer have a home, they no longer have access to their children. And in the end, they've left with nothing. And so they often take their own lives. And that's the bigger problem is that we're not willing to acknowledge that just because it wasn't by her hand doesn't mean she didn't have a hand in the decision that he's made.
And also, no one wants to talk about the rates of child abuse, where in studies such as in the States, female male abusers are pretty much the same. It's 47% in some studies,
Mm.
and it depends on the studies you're looking at. So, for feminists to use these taglines such as male violence, it's not really reflective of reality when you're talking about children at all.
No, and I've, recently started doing some reading around the child maltreatment and the research around that, and yeah, it's usually mothers that are the ones that are mistreat children, but, there's also you're seeing a massive rise in sexual abuse by women towards young men, like, whereas before, I don't think and I think it was always there, we just didn't recognize it. It was like, "Oh, aren't you lucky, you got to have sex with a woman." Whereas not seeing it as
Mhm, mhm.
violence, that was the problem. We weren't seeing it as violence, and it is, these young children, and there's so many cases in the US at the moment that I've been following that where this has occurred. Um, but again, it's like we've just been ignoring it. I think a lot of the time, US seems to be good at really bringing it to the light at the moment.
Yes, it's been something I've noticed along with the gun culture, mass shootings, but definitely. And when they are 20 years ago, Mary Kay Letourneau, where she married her student in the end, and then he's recently, I think 5 years ago, recently
Mm,
divorced her, and then he started talking about being a victim of sexual abuse, where for many years he was not, saying the same thing. And it's
mm,
interesting to see the way the media embraces or rejects. Well, let's just go to the most obvious example. Since I mentioned Candace Owens earlier, she's been following the Macron affair. Okay, now isn't it interesting? We have a sitting president who was a victim of sexual abuse by law, and this has gone undiscussed completely, right? It's just let be in the
mhm.
corner. And so I find that fascinating that we have all the laws on the books, but when men are victims of sexual grooming or sexual abuse, as you said earlier, it's, oh, aren't you lucky? Oh, she's a
Yeah.
cougar or she's a MILF.
Mm. And that's those attitudes, aren't they? That attitude's been around for a long time, and I think finally men are going, "Actually, no, it's not okay." And that case of the woman you were talking about was the teacher, wasn't she?
That's right.
She married yeah, I did see a documentary about the 2 of them together, and it's like it was almost like by marrying him, it justified her behavior, like,
Mhm.
no, it doesn't. You're still an abuser. And I don't care if you're a female, you still took advantage of someone that was underage. But yeah, it's something that I think is starting to the attitude towards that is starting to change. But for a long time, it was yeah, aren't you lucky kind of attitude, which is just you know so many men out there have suffered abuse. And we don't talk about that. So many young boys suffer abuse, and young boys become adult men who are victims of abuse as a child.
This case, I recall it was in the mid-90s, and she married her then well, she didn't marry him at the time, but she began a relationship with
No.
her 12-year-old student, and I remember I was living
Oh,
in New York at the time, and you'd see people talking about it on the subway, and they were like, "Dude," like, "high five." I was thinking, "This is insane." But then
yeah.
after 12 years of marriage, her husband filed for a separation, and I think it was around right before lockdown, they got divorced, and then he started to speak out. I remember following that. Or, the case of Harvey Weinstein is a drop in the bucket because I remember Corey Feldman, the actor, who was speaking out about
Mm,
this again since the 90s, and he was basically depicted as insane by the media, which I found
mm,
horrifying because for a man of his stature to come out and speak about the sexual abuse that he went through was not an easy task. People even accused him of
mm,
trying to revive his failed career. No, I don't think there's a case of someone being able to revive their career through any kind of sexual abuse scandal. None. But whatever. I found it really sad. And I hope that he gets his day because he was again put in the dustbin, even around the Weinstein files. And everyone was just sort of dismissing him because he was a man. I was like, what the hell? This is
mm,
crazy. And paradoxically, Kevin Spacey, who was acquitted, who was vindicated, he lost his
mm.
career, and a lot of went on with him. Remember the case of him putting his hand on a man's leg? It was a man.
That's right, yeah.
He might have been 18 or 19, but he was not a kid. And that had a boatload of homophobia. The feminists were all about how Kevin Spacey's a pedophile. I'm like, I was in a group being told by women that I'm a misogynist because I pointed out that this was a man, not a child. Anyways, again, who cares about facts? It's just insane what's gone on since the Weinstein affair, but you're not a stranger to canceling due to what happened to you. But how did your suspension from the University of Tasmania and the police training program affect your research goals?
I think I did sort of lose my way in terms of focusing on the psychopaths initially, and I did focus very much on the domestic violence stuff because I felt like I was being treated like I was a liar, like I'd had this interview and I'd been dishonest, and it made no sense to me because it felt like gaslighting. It really did, because I was like, hang on, but you loved what I was doing, you loved what I was teaching. So I really engulfed myself for a long time in the research around domestic violence, around female perpetrators, to basically prove myself right, because I would have loved, if I thought that I was wrong, I would have come out and said something different. But so for a time there, and I'm getting back into the female psychopathic stuff now, but I really wanted to understand that domestic violence perpetrated by women and how that was being treated by police, but also in the media, and really see that as a new bow and a new feather in my cap, almost, as in terms of research and understanding, and how closely it aligned with the work I was doing on female psychopaths, because many of them were from feminist organizations, from domestic violence organizations, from feminist spaces that said all men bad or women good. So it was surprising the amount of overlap there that I never ever expected.
Do you believe the cancel culture is preventing honest academic discussions about the dark traits in women?
Definitely. I went to I spoke at a conference last year, the Australian Science and Freedom Conference, and I talked about the cancel culture. And there was a number of people there that had similar experiences to me in universities, where they tried to speak up about some of this stuff. And because universities are very, very woke, are very, very entrenched in feminization,
Mhm.
that you just can't talk about it when you work at a university. And I thought I was protected from that because I was teaching police. So I didn't spend a lot of time in the university culture. But I quickly found out that that's not the case, that the universities have definitely lost their way, because if they cared about truth, they would allow people to do the research. They would have given me the data and said, okay, I want you to show me that you're wrong. Look at the data, do, and then we can prove that. But I was never given that opportunity. In fact, no one even looked at what I was teaching. It didn't matter what I was teaching. I could have been getting up there and talking about unicorns and rainbows. Nobody actually cared. It was the perception of what my attitudes were and what I was potentially teaching, that mattered more to them than actually what I was teaching, which is very, very sad. And universities was something else I definitely looked at it a lot more after I left, was in terms of the amount of academics that have been kicked out of universities for talking about the things that I've talked about as well, because they've come out and said, hang on a minute, no, we need to look further at this, but they won't allow the research to be done. So when I initially did my tried to get my PhD up, it took me 3 years, because I tried through a number of avenues in terms of psychology, um, health sector. There was a few different areas I looked at, and nobody would touch it because I specifically was looking at women. The only reason I managed to get it up with the University in Western Australia, which is the other side of Australia from where I am, was because of Professor Clive Boddy, who is the leading researcher in the corporate psychopathic field. He was at the University of Tasmania. He went back to Curtin University in Western Australia, and I followed him. And because they loved his work, I was able to get my research up. But it had to be in the management sector. I couldn't actually, psychology would not touch it, because I was specifically focusing on women. And I can tell you now, if I was specifically focusing on male psychopaths, I wouldn't have had any problem whatsoever. But universities avoid research that criticizes women. And I truly believe that. I've seen it.
I was thinking a lot while you were speaking earlier. I was just thinking about how some of the hypotheses or truths that feminists like to advance are actually quite sexist. For instance, this notion of traditional gender norms that feminism had heretofore battled, but in order to advance the notion that women are victims, they actually reify those. The idea that men are stronger and stoic. Okay, we know that men are physically stronger, hence, the result of domestic violence would obviously lead to more deaths of the victims. Okay. But the notion that men are always the perpetrator fits into this kind of old world thinking about men. So I'm looking at what feminists have done historically in trying to dismantle the macho image that men can also garden and cook and they should take care of children. And we've seen all of this playing out from the 60s and certainly the 70s. But now it seems like feminism has regressed into gender roles that they were supposed to have escaped from.
Hmm. Okay. Yeah, I wasn't aware of that change, but that's interesting, isn't it?
Well, I'm not saying that the change is real in and of itself. I'm saying that in order for feminists to make the argument that men are the violent ones and women are the lambs, just victims there, and if women ever use violence, it's always in a reaction, and it's always because the man did it first, the man is worse, the man is this. And I'm thinking that's a feminist own goal because the idea is, and we see this statistically, we see more and more women achieving higher roles within their industries, within government sectors, middle, high managers. We see that women are attaining levels of power never before
Mm.
seen. Or look to the infamous photos floating around this week online of von der Leyen and Callas and a few other women, and people are pointing to the irony. Who said that if women were in charge, we wouldn't see war? Because these were women who are pushing only for war, uniquely for war. So you see a lot of doublespeak going on by feminists, and in fact, we've tackled this on the show and in articles. These feminists are often the ones pushing for the war in Ukraine, the genocide in Gaza,
Mhm.
because we'll make up a bunch of reasons why. If you are really a feminist, you should probably be against war because the first people getting killed in war are children and
Yes.
women.
Yeah. And yeah, so I'm not sure whether you're aware of Rachel Wilson. She wrote a book called Occult Feminism that she was recently on the Joe Rogan podcast, and she's done some amazing research. She's not a researcher; she's just someone who has done the work and written this book about the fact that yeah, feminism was always a lie. It was always based in cunningness and manipulation. It was never what it set out to be, and that the women that are hailed as the leaders of feminism were actually con artists and liars and abusers. It's a very, very interesting read, and she's a very, very interesting woman. And I think, and again, like this is not my area of expertise, but I think she talks a bit about, I think it came from her. Correct me if I'm wrong, is that yes, most wars are started by women. Like you hear this talk about, women should run the world, men have had their chance. Well, it would burn to the ground if that was the case, because women are the ones pushing for the wars. Women are the ones, that are often the aggressors, even in society, not just in relationships, which is quite fascinating because yes, they are the ones pushing. They are the ones picketing for the wars, and yeah, it's people just refuse to acknowledge that.
You mentioned in your work how men are afraid to come forward. Male victims are, depending on the study, I found several studies that show about 45 to 50% less likely to see their perpetrators charged compared to female victims. That's just in the charging section, even lower when it comes to reporting. And there's a lack of support for men. Many men feel that domestic violence resources are uniquely for women, and often they are.
Mm,
Even here, where I'm getting support, I ask them, "Do you support men?" "No, we're for women only." So they often have no place to turn.
mm,
Then there's the fear of disbelief and arrest, and of course, women often use legal means of lawfare, of constant battles in courts, and then threats of their not having any contact with their children.
mm,
What can you say to this in terms of even the restriction of parental rights and then the court system that often will react in the similar thread because men are not believed?
mm. Because women hold all the power in divorce. They do. They hold all the power, and they withhold the children. They manipulate the children to dislike the father. And men are left on the outer. Men are the ones that are kicked out of the home. And they have nothing. They have no power in that situation. Because all women need to say is, "I don't feel safe. I don't, I've experienced violence." And I'm not saying everyone's dishonest. I don't want ever to anyone to think that, but I know a lot of women, and I've worked with a lot of men, and where women have deliberately used that as a narrative to isolate the man and punish him, even if she was in the wrong in the relationship. There was someone recently who talked about. I saw on it was an online case where she'd gone off and had an affair, so he decided to leave, but he got kicked out of the home, he lost access to his children. She claimed he'd been violent, and none of it was true. But women hold all the power. We have so much power. It's especially in divorce situations, and parental alienation is usually instigated by women as a way of punishing the man.
Well, things are beginning to change.
Mm,
Stakeholders are now increasingly advocating for gender inclusive approaches to training to improve professional awareness of female perpetrated violence. Could you talk a bit about what you're seeing on the horizon that might give some relief to victims, not only men, but as I explained my situation,
mm,
it's hell to be a woman who's been an abuse victim of another woman. It's not that you're not even believed, you are, but then the feminists remain silent. Or I was in my support services that I received at one point, I said something snarky about feminism and, well, this is, patriarchy still exists. And I said, well, not really. I mean, we need to stop this kind of pigeonholing one kind of person because it's doing no favor to anyone.
mm. Look, I think things are changing definitely, and I don't know whether it's just I'm more engulfed in that space now or what, but I do feel like things are changing. More men are speaking up. More women are being. Like I said, even in Tasmania, that the report that came out this week in the Examiner about the local newspaper about the fact that they were arresting more women. So I think things are changing, because I think women have been less covert about their behaviour. I think women are openly, slapping men in public, and not caring. Just going, well, I can do whatever I like. There's no boundaries. You think about a child with no boundaries, they do become unruly. And it's the same thing with many women these days. They think they can do what they like and get away with it, but it's become so overt now. It's not as covert as it used to be. That authorities do need to step in, police do need to step in, and it is being recognised a lot more, because I think there are a lot more women like me out there who are stepping up, and yourself, and going, hang on a minute, there's something wrong here. And unfortunately, I think it has taken women that are willing to stand up and go, actually, feminists are selling us a lie here, and men are suffering because we're not sticking up for them, but also we're not recognizing the female perpetration of violence. And it's a massive issue. And I think we're starting to see a lot more of that now. And we're seeing a lot more people speaking up, um, around the narrative of women can be really ruthless and really nasty.